This recording is protected by copyright. No part may be reproduced without the prior permission of the University of South Australia.
This morning's session is a panel devoted to one project. So we have 4 presenters all talking about different aspects of the same project. And the title of the panel is Developing and Interpreting Personal Narratives in the Hostile Stories Project. And to begin with, we'll have a shared presentation by Rachel Ankeny and Karen Agater, and called Unsettling Narratives, Prejudice in the Hostile Stories Project. And Rachel is the team leader for the project and the postgraduate coordinator for the graduate program in food studies and associate dean of research for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Adelaide. Karen is a historian with a focus on migration, and she is currently studying for her second PhD as part of the Hostile Stories Project at the University of Adelaide. Then we'll have a presentation by Catherine Manning titled Making Memories, Recreating South Australia's Migrant Hostels. And Catherine is a curator at the Migration Museum. She's been there since 2002. And the last paper will be by Daniela Pilla, called Rules of Engagement, Oral Histories in the Migrant Communities. And Daniela is currently a PhD candidate in the Department of History and Politics at the University of Adelaide. And I'm Rena Ben-Mayor. In case you haven't noticed, I have a different accent, and so I am not a migrant, but could be. All right, so we'll start, and have we decided to leave all the questions for the end? Okay, great. All right, so with that.
Thanks very much. So I'm going to start, and Karen and I are doing sort of a bit of a tag team here. This is a paper that we are in the process of developing for publication, so we really would love feedback, just to say that at the beginning. The following quote is a paraphrase of an off-the-record comment by one of our participants. Is that tape recorder on? It's not? Good. Before we start, I need to get something off my chest. I really resent the way in which Australia is dealing with migrants today. Take the new arrivals here, 14 families in total. Illegals, I call them. They come here and they're given everything, including new houses. That's just not right. The irony of this remark is that this migrant and his wife came to South Australia from England in the late 1960s on an assisted passage scheme, colloquially known as the 10-pound palm scheme, and were employer-sponsored. He had a job to go to. They were escorted to the town where they were to be settled, having spent a few days in the Elder Park hostel, and then accommodated in a hostel before being given a brand new home within a few weeks' time. They had money to buy a car within days. All their furniture was shipped from the UK, and they had money from the sale of their assets, including a house in England, as well as being provided funds to return back to the UK if they wished. Like many of our interviewees, this migrant explicitly did not want his comments about current-day migrants to be on the record, but emphasized that he felt that he had to say this. We frequently receive similar comments both about current-day migrants, but also about migrants from groups other than the originating group, either in terms of socioeconomic class or country of origin. We receive these in interviews and also in passing in letters of registration, letters or registrations of interest, and more casual conversations. In the collection of oral testimonies for the Hostile Stories Project, we've encountered many positive and uplifting stories of migrant contributions to those who came after them, including how they involved themselves in supporting later migrants through volunteer work or involvement in migrant-related organizations, and of the establishment of ethnic groups as both preservers of culture and structures for support. Nonetheless, we've also been confronted with a number of more challenging issues arising in the oral histories, including reports of illegal activity and angry and prejudicial comments about other migrants, both during former residents' times in the hostel and in the contemporary context. Our point is not that these issues were surprising to us, but that we've been struck by the way the latter issues in particular are framed, as many of these prejudicial statements occur off the record. So our framing questions for today's talk relate to these issues, which include: how should we analyze such comments? What do they really mean? Do we as historians have obligations to consider these sorts of comments when analyzing our interviews and other data, suitably anonymized and so on, to fulfill ethical requirements, given they arise not infrequently and have implications for the historical story we wish to tell, as well as for current day issues arising out of this history. Third, should we alter our interview scripts to specifically engage such issues and/or arrange follow-up interviews, allowing anonymity as usual if participants wish, to focus on more sensitive issues? Finally, what insights might these narratives give us into the broader story of migrants' experiences in the hostel system and their settlement in Australia, as well as future migration policy? Today, we consider these questions using examples from the comments we have heard in the context of the Hostel Stories project. In brief, the talk takes the following form, and I won't go through the outline, but you get the idea. We're going to tell you a bit about the project and the sources. Karen's going to take us through some of the literature on the contentious issues, and then I'll come back for some conclusions and reflections on what we're thinking about from here. So just a very brief background. A lot of you are familiar with this project. A lot of our partners are in the room. In May 2012, the Australian Research Council funded project Hostel Stories towards a richer narrative of the lived experience of migrants began. The project team is composed of staff and students at the University of Adelaide in conjunction with community and government partners, the Migration Museum, State Records of South Australia, the Vietnamese Community in Australia South Australia Chapter, Port Adelaide Enfield Council, and the City of Charles Sturt. The aim of the project is to capture and explore the migrant experiences in the post-World War II hostel system in South Australia. Although the migrant hostels played significant roles in post-war immigration to this country, little scholarly research has been previously conducted on the topic, especially in South Australia. Archival research is a major contributor to the project's knowledge base. However, as has been noted repeatedly in this conference, official records provide just one side of the story, official information and so on. We can explore policy and practice, but it's very difficult to explore day-to-day lives of the hostel residents. We sometimes hear migrant voices through letters of complaint, for instance, but it's the official point of view that dominates the document. So oral histories are obviously essential to the project. In brief, our process for obtaining oral histories involves soliciting registrations of interest and being interviewed through popular media, public events, word of mouth, and so on. Interview candidates are asked to complete a brief questionnaire, which includes questions about basic experience, about their migration, and their migrant hostel experiences in particular. We then select interviewees depending on a range of principles, but we're interested in trying to cover the hostels, look at diverse groups in terms of ethnic origin and locale of origin before migration, and a range of time periods. Working within the parameters of university ethics procedures and professional guidelines for oral history, we generally conduct our interviews in the homes of the interviewees because they're often a little less mobile or elderly and so on. In the interviews themselves, we utilize a predetermined set of questions which are nonetheless open-ended. It allows the interviewees to take it sort of in directions of their own interest. The script arose out of the project that pre-existed at the Migration Museum about hostel stories, and the Migration Museum obviously has a clear mandate to record community memories, but also attempts not to perpetuate stereotypes or negative views in the processes of this documentation. Our project, as a broader scholarly undertaking, tries to go beyond this limitation, but obviously has to balance our obligations also to our community partners. Interviews last anywhere between 20 minutes and 2 hours, depends on what the interviewees have to say, the length of the stay, and the number of hostels in which they reside. Obviously, in such a short period of time, it's not possible to deeply explore all the aspects of the migrant experience. I'm just going to put up the kinds of things we typically ask to give you an idea of the typical background, but I want to shift fairly quickly onward to the issues that we've noted in these cases. We analyze their interviews following transcription using conventional oral history methodologies, but because of some of these issues that have arisen with sensitive topics, we've begun experimenting with techniques from the social sciences, which also focus on what's not discussed, silences, uses of unusual phrases and words, and things set off the record. We quickly found that the interviewees often chose to take the conversation in more touchy areas, many of which are quite confronting. As mentioned at the outset, these include illegal activities such as potential child abuse by other residents and staff, illegal activities including home abortions, scams run by visitors to the hostel attempting to sell property or goods. But most commonly, these sensitive issues reflect what we have roughly termed racial prejudice. These types of comments about more sensitive areas tend to occur on and off the record. But interestingly, when interviewees want to express what could be seen as racially prejudiced comments about fellow migrants, past and present, they're very keen to ensure it does not form part of the official recorded record. Typically, they mention these issues at the start of an interview, following a tea break, and they often ask, is the tape recorder on yet, as in the quote at the start of the talk. Then after being reassured we're not audio recording at that point, they launch into a tirade of negative comments. These sorts of attitudes have been infrequently noted in published literature, with the notable exception of Collins's bold suggestion in 1988 that Australia's earlier migrant arrivals, the subject of prejudice themselves, often become the perpetuators of prejudice. Furthermore, migrant hostels, the very subject of our inquiry, housed hundreds of thousands of people from enormously diverse backgrounds in close quarters and sometimes less than ideal conditions, many of whom had fled extremely poor conditions following war or economic decline. So we've heard from one German interviewee that certain nationalities were clean and others dirty, in inverted commas. From a British migrant that there was lots of what we call new Australians, Bulgarians, Slavs, all sorts of nationalities there. A lot of them were wild fellas, you know. They wouldn't, no respect for women. Some of them were nice people, nice blokes, but a lot of them were riffraff. A refugee from the 60s described Vietnamese refugees as forest people in bad shape. The most typical comments are about how refugees or migrants of today have it so much better than the interviewee and his or her family did. These fit into what migration scholars in informal conversation call rites of passage, a term used to describe the fact that particular migrants or groups of migrants believe they had it the hardest, they suffered the most. However, we've not been able to document any analysis of this tendency in the scholarly literature.
So, in order to consider what these comments mean and how we should analyse them, we first looked to the existing scholarly literature. We found examples of similar dilemmas encountered by scholars using interviews in their work, especially, you've done that for me. You can keep doing that. Especially when they are explicitly discussing and looking at difficult and contested topics. So, for example, the sociologist Blee, in her work in the US on the Ku Klux Klan, raises really valid methodological points about performing oral histories with challenging subjects, particularly in her emphasis on the fact that our questioning should not be blinded by any potential disgust at what we hear. Rather, as she argues, oral history is a valuable way to allow a more systematic and deeper analysis of such difficult and contested issues, and to represent the points of view of others with whom we may fundamentally disagree. Similarly, the historians Scheffel, I really don't know how to pronounce their names, it's on the Scheftel, and Zimbruski, in their work on Holocaust survivors in Montreal, argue that difficult interview spaces are often ignored or brushed over as, quote, oral historians have been so concerned with legitimising the craft that we have been wary about publicly discussing the murky situations in which we sometimes find ourselves, end quote. Certainly their attempts to make sense of what is happening within and outside of the interview space and to open up conversations with other scholars about difficult interview spaces resonates with us and our dilemmas in the current project. But what of the more directly comparative literature on migrant interviews? For many decades, oral historians have been interviewing migrants about their experiences, and yet little appears to have been written by them about migrant prejudice and how to interpret such material when it emerges in oral histories. Do such views reflect a new phenomenon? Certainly, as we mentioned earlier, Collins did not think so. And yet migrant oral histories continue to revolve around the traditional and perhaps one could argue safe narratives of the journey, the quality of the food, and how they settled to make a better life. One notable exception can be found in the work of British historian Cynthia Brown. In 2006, her study of 2006 of migrant communities in Britain, she noted that immigrant prejudice, which she encountered on the record, even though interviewees were not explicitly asked to discuss the topic or encouraged to do so. One particular example she gives is striking and could easily have been made by one of our interviewees. Remember, we were invited, this is in the 1950s, we were not refugees, we were not asylum seekers, we were invited to come here. We were not skiving, we were not lazy. You know, we were there, hard working, but nobody bothered to look and see what was happening to us. Why all this now? Everybody is trying to help. Nobody helped us. In order to address our questions about how to proceed with our interviews and how we might interpret such remarks, in the context of our project to document migrant experiences in the hostel system, we asked the following question: why do these attitudes exist? Much has been written generally on the origins and expressions of racism and prejudice, and many hypotheses have been posed. Can any of these theories inform us as we negotiate methods for examining the prejudicial remarks made by some migrants about other migrants? One key theory is that expressions of prejudice are examples or expressions of deeper problems within society. For example, perceived or actual socio-economic disadvantage. Many scholars outline how these problems are then blamed on new arrivals, so that, as Collins argues, immigrants are scapegoated for problems of the broader society. Therefore, as McAllister and Moore explain, and I quote, "The continual inflow of migrants means that the feelings of prejudice and social distance that particular groups hold towards other groups change as the ethnic and racial mix of the population alters." End quote. Is there evidence in the comments of previous migrants towards current-day asylum seekers of a continuation of scapegoating? Certainly sociologists have several theories for intergroup bias, or what Sumner in 1906 labelled ethnocentrism. Sumner argued that one's own group is the centre of everything, and all others are scaled and rated with reference to it. Each group nourishes its own pride and vanity, boasts itself superior, exalts its own divinities, and looks with contempt on outsiders. While much has been written about this theory over the past 100 years, and it's still used today, most of it is concerned with host and migrant relations rather than migrant-to-migrant relations, and hence this might well prove an interesting line of inquiry. Finally, is there a link between what we hear in these comments and the views of the surrounding society? Are these interview comments expressions of what McAllister and Moore argue are mirrors of society, in that the longer established immigrants develop views of ethnic groups that differ only in minor detail from the Australian-born? Or are these expressions of what Zick et al. Define as horizontal prejudice, namely negative ethnic attitudes towards members of other ethnic minorities? In their studies on the relationship between ethnic minorities in Germany, they found such prejudice was more pronounced in those groups who were less supportive of integration. Accordingly, might the study of the negative comments that we hear have important implications to today's increasingly diverse communities and the future of multiculturalism? In summary, it is apparent that those collecting and using oral testimonies are sometimes confronted by difficult and sometimes challenging comments and responses, and that long-term scholarly investigation provides theories about potential motivations underlying prejudicial beliefs. But it is also apparent that few conversations have occurred about how to deal with such confronting information. As Yao says, we come to these people in a special, and I quote, "in a special role as collectors and preservers of accounts of human experience. Inspire people to speak honestly and fully about their experiences," end quote. But what if this honesty elicits unexpected and challenging information? How do we deal with these responses?
So some reflections. Clearly there's considerable conflict for us around this issue. On the one hand, as scholars, we have a duty to fully reflect and report prevailing attitudes and opinion, discriminatory or not. On the other, we're trying to build a level of trust with both interviewees and the broader community, including the organizations that are partners in the project. It must be noted a measure of that trust can be found in the fact that participants are in fact willing to voice their opinions, despite knowing on some level that some of their comments might be problematic, as is reflected in their desire to confirm that they're off the record. Another reflection of their awareness of the nature of their comments is that they often preface such comments by saying something like, "I'm not a racist, but." If we were to report such negative comments in our published research, even suitably anonymized, this might destroy some of the trust we've built up. More formally, some might argue the constraints of ethics approval and professional standards for doing oral history should limit the pursuit of lines of inquiry raised by participants when they fall outside of pre-approved areas, particularly when they verge into sensitive topics. Perhaps it's critical to note that although the Hostel Stories team set out its oral histories with a specific agenda, namely to determine specific facts about hostile conditions and life within the hostels that are not documentable in the written record, our objectives do not completely align with those of the people who have volunteered to be interviewed. Not surprisingly, they have their own reasons for wanting to be interviewed, which range quite radically. But the issues that our interviews raise, which fall outside of our usual script or overarching themes, are obviously just as relevant to understanding migrant hostel experiences, whether they reflect prevailing attitudes at the time of arrival or attitudes shaped by the time in the hostel or subsequent experiences after settlement. So what should we do in the future? One option is to continue with our current approach to oral history. However, we're fairly confident this will not properly fulfill our role as historians. An alternative would be to broaden our lines of inquiry, perhaps by returning to select interviewees for subsequent discussions or small focus groups, and to explore the issues they have raised. In more theoretical terms, we must also take into account Brown's argument that powerful as oral histories of racism undoubtedly are in promoting tolerance and understanding, too narrow a focus on these may also reinforce the victim status that many of those on the receiving end of racism have long since discarded. They've moved on. Can we as oral historians do the same? End quote. But it's not clear that Australian migrants have in fact managed to move beyond these dialogues, and hence we may need to actively promote moving beyond traditional questions in narratives of migration. Similar questions were raised in the 1990s when Kirikou asked if continuing to focus on festivals and celebrations as main tropes in migrant history simply produced more of what was described as, quote, nice, safe material that would allow the host community to understand our religious customs, food, and traditions, and be more tolerant towards us, and not to talk about our suppression and exploitation at the hands of racists. Kirikou argues that the dominant British perspective, taken in much of Australian history, migrant history, disallows ethnic community groups to describe themselves in their own terms. Rather, it foists a set of guidelines for all of them to follow. He asks the reader to, quote, take a look in a library, you'll see books on food, religious festivals, clothes, customs, and traditions. You will not understand people, their actions, feelings, and resentments from these alone. It is a trivialization of their lives and their history, end quote. And the same might even apply to those from the British Isles, whose diverse voices we may not have adequately heard in the past. More generally, this raises the question about potential trivialization created by having set questions and formats traditionally used in oral interviews with migrants. Kirikou also points out much oral history work, as in our project, is institutionalized and out of control of the contributors, following fixed procedures. So if we continue to ask migrants only traditional and more factual questions, are we both trivializing their experiences and missing important potential research material, particularly about assimilation, integration, and multiculturalism? What are our responsibilities to our partners and to our interviewees to develop rich narratives about the diversity of the experiences? This brings us to the crux of the paper and back to our focal questions. Can we move beyond the inflexibility of traditional oral history methods, and should we? What are the ethical, social, methodological considerations relating to allowing more flexible or free-form interviews in this context? What do we ask, and who do we ask? Perhaps most importantly, how do we interpret what we say, what they say, and don't say? If, as Thompson argues, personal testimony offers unique, quote, glimpses into the lived interior of migration processes, end quote, aren't these issues part of the bigger picture of migration history? Would it be unethical not to use this project as an opportunity to capture neglected points of view and to contribute to a more forthright conversation about the conflicts which remain among recent migrants to this day and implications for future migration policy? We look forward to your comments and feedback on these complex issues.